Hi everyone, and welcome to a new animated manipulation tutorial on my channel. Today we'll be looking at how you can create this Earth to Mars portal / teleportation scene by combining multiple images and graphics. We'll also go through the process of turning it into an animated piece inside After Effects. First, let's open Adobe Photoshop. Let's go to File, New to create a new document. You can set the dimensions however you want, but I usually go for 2000 by 2500 and click Create. Let's unlock this here. Also, you can always close the windows which you don't need as well. Now we can go ahead and import our first image, and I'm going to start with the ground. Of course, I'll be linking all the assets I'm going to be using today in the description box below, and if you feel like playing around with the project files, you can find both PSD and AEP files on my Patreon page as usual. Alright, once you import any image to Photoshop, you always have the option to resize and change its position, and once you're happy with the result, you can simply go here and confirm the changes. Let's not forget to give the layer a proper name by double clicking here to rename it. I'm gonna call this one ground, and with the layer selected, let's add a layer mask which will allow us to manipulate the image in a non-destructive mode. Now obviously I'm gonna attempt to remove the sky here, so to do that, let's grab the quick selection tool and draw around the sky. And now to remove the selected area, simply press delete on your keyboard. Now press Ctrl D to deselect. If there's any pixels left out, you can always switch over to the eraser tool and simply delete these parts. Just always double check whether the opacity is set to 100 to make sure you're erasing properly. I actually don't need this layer here, so let's go ahead and send it to the bin over here. Alright, next. Now I obviously chose this image because of how much it resembles to Mars planet. The landscape looks quite similar except for the color, so let's change that. And for this kind of edits, I usually go online and search for images that I can use as a reference. For instance, here I'm looking for Mars ground images, and I actually think this is the look I'm gonna go for, so I will use that as an example when adjusting the ground colors. And to do that, let's add a hue saturation layer above the ground, right click and choose create clipping mask. And this is to make sure that this adjustment layer only affects the layer that comes directly below it. First, enable colorize, and all I need to do now is set the right hue and play around with both saturation and lightness until I get the look or tone of color that I'm after. There you go. I think this is pretty close to my reference, and I also think it needs to be slightly darker. So let's add another brightness and contrast adjustment layer, and let's bring the brightness down somewhere here. You can also increase the contrast a bit as well. Alright, looks good. Moving on, now let's bring the galaxy image, scale it up. Obviously I want to make sure the landscape is going to be below the horizon here. This way we'll only be able to see the sky part of the photo. Once positioned properly, let's move the layer all the way towards the bottom here. Let me adjust its position a bit, and I'm gonna call this one galaxy. Of course, it still looks off compared to the rest of the scene, so let's add an exposure layer, create clipping mask, and let's bring the exposure down. You can also adjust the gamma a bit as well. So the goal is to match the darkness of both the ground and sky and make them both fit nicely into the scene. Now if you look closely here towards the horizon, you can see that there is a gradient of colors, so naturally that should leak a bit around the mountain edges. So let's go and add some highlights around this area. The colors are different on both sides, so we'll need to treat them a bit differently. First, let's go over here and add another hue layer. We will use this one to add highlights on the right side of the horizon. Now change the hue until it matches the orange color that can be seen on the right side. You can also bump up the saturation as well as the brightness until you achieve the bright yellow look. Now of course we want this to be applied around the top right side only. So to do that, make sure the layer mask is selected and press Ctrl I to invert. Let's switch to the brush tool. Make sure the foreground color is set to white. Let me just change back to the default brush over here. You can always resize it. I'm gonna make it a bit smaller, and let's reduce the opacity to 40% and simply start painting the highlights around the edges here. If you feel like you need to revert or reduce the highlights, you can simply press X to switch the foreground color back to black and use the same brush tool to erase around the highlight areas that you want to be removed. And now obviously you can follow the exact same steps to create the second highlight on the left side, except that we're gonna enable colorize and change the hue to this blue to match it with the color of the sky around the left bottom side here. The cool thing here is that even after masking out the highlights, you can always go back to the layer properties and adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness again to make sure everything looks just right. And to keep our project organized, let's group all ground layers in one folder. So to do that, just select the layer at the very top, hold shift and select the ground image, and then click on this icon right here to place all selected layers inside a new folder, which I'm gonna name ground group. Okay, now to make things a little bit more dramatic, let's add in a bit of fog in front of the mountains here. Change back to the brush tool and set the color to light gray. Now I do have a certain brush that I want to use for this, which is part of the VisualforJulius brush pack, which I use quite often honestly, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Since this is actually a paid pack, I'll leave links to alternative brushes that you can get for free. But if you can afford this pack, I highly recommend that you guys go and get it, as it has almost everything you need, and it's been really useful for me for a while now. So I'm gonna go here and select one of the fog brushes that are available in this pack. I think this one is perfect, and then I'm just gonna paint around the mountains here. Nothing too crazy, just to get a sort of a hazy look in the distance. I don't want to overdo it, so what I will do is reduce the opacity down to 40% or so. Alright, and now we can move to a really fun part of this artwork, which is creating the actual portal. So let's bring this image in, which is meant to represent Earth in our scene. I'm gonna give it a descriptive name as usual. Now the next technique that you're about to see is something I learned from another YouTuber. I'm not gonna say his name because I don't want to mispronounce it, but I'll put a link to his channel below. I highly recommend that you guys go and check him out. You'll definitely learn a lot from that guy. So first, with the earth layer selected, let's add a layer mask. Press Ctrl I to invert. Select the brush tool. Make sure the foreground color is set to white. For this, I'm gonna need a brush that has rough edges all around, and if you're using the same pack that I'm using, you'll find that storm clouds works pretty well for this case, so let's go with that. I'm gonna scale it down a bit. Make sure both opacity and flow are set to 100, and simply start painting around the center here. Of course, how big you want the portrait to be is totally up to you. You can always press X to change to eraser mode and adjust the edges. Also, you can always press Ctrl T to have access to free transform controls and move the layer around. And you see this little link icon here? That's telling us that both the image and the mask are connected. What happens if we disable this is that we're now able to transform them separately. So for example, now I can move the image while the portal stays locked in place, which is pretty cool. I'm gonna link them back for now and make sure the portal is placed exactly what I want it. Alright, now let's go ahead and add some glow around the edges of the portal, which is really very simple to achieve. All you need to do is right click on the portal layer and choose blending options. Now let's enable outer glow, and you'll see here a bunch of properties show up. Make sure the blend mode is set to screen. Now let's change the color to something more vivid. You can go with the color of your choice, of course, but I'm happy with this particular blue. And as you change the color, you can see it updating in real time, so you can preview the result as you're adjusting. I'm gonna increase the opacity a bit more to make sure the effect is visible. You can leave both spread and size at 0. Let's change the range to 50 or so. And to add a bit more energy to the portal, let's add in inner glow. But let's set the color to something different this time. I'm gonna go with this pink right here. Blending mode is set to screen, which is just right. I'm gonna set the opacity somewhere around 50%. Obviously, you don't have to copy the exact same values I'm using. You can always play around with these properties to shape the portal in a way you think looks best. Now, I think I still want to add a bit more depth inside the portal to kind of separate the two worlds a bit more. And I think I can achieve that by darkening the edges inside. So let's go back to the layer effects once again, enable inner shadow. Let's set the opacity to 100 and change the angle to 120 or so, and now increase the distance to expand the shadow further inside. It's currently too harsh, so let's bump up the size to soften the edges a little bit. And you can always disable and enable the effect to see the difference. I think the shadows kind of took over the pink glow, so let's decrease its opacity. Maybe I'll go back to the outer glow and increase its opacity. The secret is not to overdo these effects. As long as we have the right color, the rough randomized edges that give it a sort of a energetic look, everything else is just little details that you can add to optimize the look. Another thing I want to do here is add a bit of brightness to the portal, since it should technically be emitting light. And to do that, let's add an exposure layer right on top. Increase the exposure value. Currently it's affecting the whole scene, but we'll fix that in a minute. You can play around with the gamma as well. Alright, now with the layer mask selected, press Ctrl I again, select the brush tool and switch back to the default brush. Let's bring the opacity down to 60% and simply start painting on the portal edges to apply the new exposure adjustments around that area. And of course, if you feel like adjusting any of the exposure settings, you can simply select the layer again to bring the properties back up and change the values. Personally, I think it's too bright, so I would bring the exposure down a little bit. And by the way, even at this point, you can always go back to the portal layer mask and adjust the edges using the brush tool. So you can actually still reshape the portal very easily. Alright, now since the portal is technically a source of light, we should be able to see some light projected on the ground here. First, let's add some rays coming out of the portal itself. So let's create a new layer, which I'm gonna call Light Rays. Make sure you have the brush tool selected, and as usual, I'm gonna browse the same brush pack which has some light rays included. Let's go to Sun Rays folder and pick one of these. I think this one is perfect, so let's go with that. Let's change the color to solid white. Once you apply the rays, you can press Ctrl T to transform and move it around or simply rotate it. Alright, cool. Now we can move ahead and work on our main subject, which is the astronaut. Before we go to that, a lot of you guys always ask me where I get the assets I use in my photo manipulations. Well, I've said it before, usually I get real life images from websites like Unsplash. The photos there are completely free to use, and I will always include links to specific images in the description box. Apart from that, sometimes I would go on Google and search for specific objects. It is a bit challenging sometimes to find a high quality image in the right angle. That's why for this project specifically, I use the website called YellowImages to get the astronaut image. But the cool thing about this website is that they have these 360 spinnable images. What that means is that you can get frames of the same subject from multiple angles, and I find this really useful for cases like this where I want the subject to fit in my camera perspective with the rest of the elements in my scene, or I can even multiply the same object and give an illusion that I'm using different images. I can think of many ways how this type of assets can be used. They also have those ready-made mockups which designers can use to preview their own products or logos, which is pretty cool. Honestly, the only thing I don't like about YellowImages is that once you purchase a 360 image, there is no option to download all frames in one package. Instead, you need to download each frame individually, which is so far from practical. So I really hope they fix that, and I'll put the link to the exact astronaut image I got from them in the description below. Besides that, you can always go on Google and search for other options. Just make sure whatever you're using is free to repurpose and doesn't require a license. Alright, so I'm gonna bring the astronaut image, which I chose. As always, first step is to position it properly and confirm. I'm gonna call this layer astronaut. Let's add a layer mask. Switch to the eraser tool. Make sure the foreground color is set to white. And to make it look like the astronaut is actually coming out of the portal, let's go ahead and erase the tips from both of his feet. Cool, that was easy. Next thing I want to do is make sure the astronaut fits in properly within the scene in terms of colors. So let's create a new exposure layer. Create clipping mask to make sure it only applies to the astronaut layer. And I want to adjust the gamma a bit here. Next, let's add a new hue saturation layer. Create clipping mask. Enable colorize. Now I want the front part of the astronaut to match the red Mars atmosphere a little bit more. So let's change the hue to red. Maybe add a bit of saturation. Reduce the brightness as well. Once you're done adjusting the colors, press Ctrl-I to invert. This is because I don't want the astronaut to have the red look entirely. Instead, I want to paint it around the front part only. I think it's a little bit too much, so I'm simply going to reduce the layers opacity over here. And now, following the same concept, we should be able to see a blue highlight around the edges of the astronaut caused by the portal itself. So let's go ahead and work on that. So same thing, just add a new hue saturation layer, create a clipping mask, enable colorize, and change the hue to blue to match it back to the color of the portal. And let's also increase the saturation and the brightness. Once that's done, let's press Ctrl-I, select the brush tool, and start painting. You can bring the brush opacity back to 100 to make it even harsher, closer to the edges, and then reduce it as you move inwards. This way the highlight is actually gradual, harsh around the edges, and softer as we move further from that. Once again, you can always go back and adjust the highlights properties after painting, so it's really flexible. Okay, I think it looks good, except that it's a little bit too much. So let's bring the layer opacity down a tiny bit, and I'm gonna do that for the red highlights as well. Let me go back to the exposure layer and make things slightly brighter. Perfect. I think it looks great now. Let's clean things up and put all these layers together in one group. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the portal is actually emitting light, and that's why we added the rays here, but technically it should project a light spot on the ground as well. So that's gonna be the next thing for us to work on. Let's go back and open the ground group folder, select the layer at the very top, and add a new exposure layer. Create a clipping mask, and let's bump the exposure. Now press Ctrl-I to invert selection, select the brush tool. I'm okay with 50% opacity, so now I'm just gonna start painting on the ground. And as you can see now, it looks like the portal is projecting light. Maybe I'll bring the opacity down and paint a bit more around the edges as well to make the light spot even softer. I think the exposure looks good, but obviously the color is still off. So let's add another hue saturation layer, create clipping mask, enable colorize, and all we need to do now is combine the right values to imitate the color of the portal. Currently it's affecting the entire ground area, so as usual press Ctrl-I to invert and use the brush tool to paint around the light spot which we created previously. And I'm sure you know by now that the secret here is to use a lower opacity to draw a large spotlight and a higher brush opacity for the center. So combining that along with both painting and erasing modes, you can create a nice looking light that's harsh in the center and softer around the edges. And to make it look even more realistic, let's change the blending mode of this layer to linear light. This will affect the hue a bit, but no need to worry. We can always go back to the layer properties and readjust the hue. Right, nice, looks good. Now of course, when there's light, there's gonna be shadow. In this case, the astronaut should be casting shadow on the ground. So let's see how we can create that. It's so simple. First, let's go over to our astronaut group, press Ctrl J to duplicate it, right click and convert to smart object, and let's name it Astro Shadow. Now press Ctrl T to transform. I'm gonna rotate it and bring it down over here. Now if you want to scale the width or height separately, all you need to do is hold down Shift, and this way you can squash the layer down and make it look like it's projected on the ground. Now with the shadow layer selected, let's go to Edit, Transform, and choose Flip Vertical. This way the layer is mirrored. We might need to transform it one more time and rotate it slightly. There you go. Next, right click on the layer, go to blending options, select color overlay, and let's change the color to black. Now let's go to filter, blur, and add Gaussian blur. Set the value to 20 or so, and finally bring the layer's opacity down to soften the shadow a little bit. And that's it. A quick, simple, and easy way to create shadows in Photoshop. Now we're pretty much done. There's still extra details which we can add here to improve the artwork. For example, I got another PNG pack images of a leaf from YellowImages, so I'm gonna add some of these frames around the astronaut. My idea is that the portal's energy field causes more elements to fly in from the Earth side, and I thought leaves would be a good option since we have a natural landscape in the background. So I pretty much imported a bunch of those images into my scene. I randomized their placements around the astronaut, and I've also added a bit of motion blur to each one of them since they are supposed to look like they're being blown out at high speed. Alright, awesome. Our manipulation is practically ready. Well, yeah, I believe there's always room for improvement and adding more elements. So if you guys manage to recreate this, I'd be really curious to see the personal touch you can add to it. One last thing I want to do here, which is part of making sure my layers are ready to be taken over to After Effects. Let me go over to Earth Portal layer, duplicate it, right click on the mask and choose Delete Layer Mask. That brings us back to the original look of this image. Now let's go over here, right click on Effects and choose Clear Layer Style. I'm gonna disable it for now, and I will explain why I did this in a few minutes, so bear with me here. And without further ado, let's leave this PSD file running and move over to Adobe After Effects.